Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
This week, and again next week, we're going to be dealing with a very, very serious topic. And of course, you've heard much about this on the national media, and that it has to do with the threat of terrorism, and particularly, of course, everyone's attention after the terrible murders of September the 11th, 2001, when we lost almost 3,000 lives from the terrorist attack. North Idaho College had created an institute to deal with this subject even prior to September the 11th, so our institution had a real foresight to deal with a problem that was already growing in the world. And I welcome to the program two guests that are very capable of discussing this very important subject. First of all, I welcome Robert Ketchum. He is North Idaho College Assistant Vice President for Instruction. He's also the Executive Director of the Workforce Training Center at North Idaho College. And this particular institute that deals with the problems of terrorism is under his jurisdiction. Robert, we've interviewed you before, but on another subject, and thank you for being with us. It's very good to have you both this week and next week on the program.
Thank you, Tony.
And I'm equally pleased to have David Dose on the program, and he is the director of the Fort Sherman Institute for Human Protection, which is an organization at North Idaho College under the auspices of Mr. Ketchum. David, welcome to the program. It's a pleasure to have you here to deal with something that's very important to the American people.
Appreciate the opportunity.
I'd like to start with you, Robert, if I may. Again, as I indicated in the introduction, this institute was actually created before we had this terrible crime. Would you give us a little historical background of how it came about and why you saw, as others at this institution, the need to address this very serious problem?
Well, Tony, you're correct that NIC was developing this plan prior to September 11th. I just returned from a conference where representatives from the U.S. Department of Labor and U.S. Department of Education just emphasized that the Bush administration sees community colleges as the nation's leader in workforce development. NIC has been very aggressive and very much a leader in this region in workforce development as well. Because of that, we had an opportunity. It was brought to our attention by one of our college trustees, Fred Ostermeyer, who had a relationship with David Dose through many years and had actually introduced David to our college when there was an opportunity for the agency in which David was employed to secure training on computer-based training development. And we found ourselves in a competition with other major providers of that training, but we were chosen at NIC to deliver that. Based on that relationship, David and Fred came to us with a plan, an idea to capture training resources that were available in our region in the area of anti-terrorism and homeland security. Even though it was not yet as obvious as it is since 9/11 that was going to be a crucial new area for training of the workforce, we felt that it had merit and should have been pursued. We were developing the plan when 9/11 occurred, and since then we've been on a very fast track to unfold this both locally, regionally, and nationally.
Thank you very much. That's very clearly stated. Dave, we'll turn to you, and you were selected when this institute was created to be its director, and obviously that's because that you have some background and experience. I have a two-part question. Number one is, give us something about your background and why you accepted this position and why you thought it was important.
I have a varied background. I was a public school teacher in Idaho for many years. I've been a law enforcement reserve police officer for several years, a county commissioner, and then spent several years as a consultant in the Department of Defense in similar types of training. Why I was selected, I guess, was probably because I approached Fred and then approached Dr. Ketchum and Dr. Burke and the rest of the college with Dr. Ketchum's help to take an opportunity I saw, more and more of a need for the types of training that I was doing for the Department of Defense to be applied appropriately to the civilian population. My belief has always been, I share the belief that a democracy can't work without an educated populace. I also believe a democracy is not safe against terrorism unless we educate. That the best thing we can do is to educate the population as much as we can on the methods and operation and awareness of how and why terrorism works. And that simple understanding renders terrorism not moot, but it simply takes away some of the impact.
It reminds me of other issues in life. If, for example, in the medical field, if you don't know certain symptoms and you don't receive treatment early enough, it can be fatal. So the same kind of principle applies here. The more knowledge and information is a twofold: one, that you know more how to try to prevent it, or secondly, to address it if it unfortunately happens.
That's a very good analogy. I would add to that to say that if you understand a problem before it occurs, you tend to react less with emotion and less with shock, which play into the hands of terrorism, and react more with logic and things that diminish the effect.
Dr. Ketchum and I call you Robert. We're colleagues, and so if that's okay. Sure. Robert, tell us a little bit more about, now that the Institute's in place, and I'm going to ask our expert here to talk about some of the motives of terrorism he just briefly mentioned, but where you're at now and your future plans. I know that there's other plans. What do you perceive for the Institute in relation to personnel? We have another one of your staff here in the studio that is certainly very vital to your program. Tell us a little bit about the staff and who you serve, and as that expands, others that you might serve that you're not serving now.
Well, this is certainly an example of thinking big and acting big. We started with a plan that would be focused on national and international training opportunities, and that has been the focus since the start. And that is unfolding, I think, very well. Since the program was started, David has grown the division from a couple of desks inside the Workforce Training Center to having acquired the 7,000 square feet that was the former home of the University of Idaho Research Park. That accompanied the addition of some specialized individuals with knowledge and skills that added to the asset base. Among the achievements was, within a month of FSI joining North Idaho College, we had contracts to develop specialized training for the state of Idaho. That was quite a coup, and it was a significant dollar amount. In addition to that, very quickly David had an opportunity to produce a training course that could be used by our customized training division in China. And David and his staff have delivered training to managers of ConocoPhillips in southern China, and next month we'll be delivering a major course to ConocoPhillips through a contract with our customized training office. It's taking advantage of some of the knowledge assets that FSI has, not in the security area, but in the area of isolated environment stress. So in addition to that, FSI has just secured a contract with the Idaho Air National Guard to deliver training in April to about 100 and how many troops are we?
It's still
being negotiated. But that is a tremendous opportunity, and the relationship with the National Guard could be very significant. So there's a great opportunity unfolding for this program that could put North Idaho College on the national map.
So you're really saying at this point, and certainly you did start out with a large vision, and that is you are going to be, already are, and going to be serving different government components and helping them deal with the threat of terrorism. Both, I would call it, it sounds like government entities within, like the state of Idaho, and there'll be other states possibly, and also the military, or like this case, the National Guard. But then you're also working with private corporations, even though some American corporations in other parts of the world where the security may even be more of a challenge.
That is the case. Because of our unique position physically near Spokane, where many of the individuals who have the skill sets that we need for this program live and reside, we're able to acquire an expertise for Fort Sherman Institute that is literally unique in the United States. And building upon that resource, the focus on governmental entities for training is going to be balanced with focus on corporate entities. And training's already been delivered to a computer firm in the Spokane Valley through a relationship with Productivity Point. We have a corporate training strategy as part of this, as well as with governmental entities. And the goals are very large. We are in preparation of a federal appropriation request that could bring significant support to this effort. And underlying all this is an opportunity to draw in significant new resources to North Idaho. Individuals coming for training on government contracts contracts with their per diem would be filling hotel rooms, spending money here. This could be a very positive economic benefit to the area as well if this program can be successful on that level of bringing the international and national trainees as we intend.
As a matter of fact, the whole inland Northwest, I'm one of those great supporters of the invisible border, and so even though it would certainly help the North Idaho area, in particular here in Kootenai County, it would certainly have impact in Spokane now. Plus, you're already helping some companies and people, so that's a starting point, but then it goes beyond that to national, even international. With that, David, I would like to turn to tap your expertise, unless we've left something out other than serving government and corporations. I guess maybe I should ask that question first. There are very famous and important leaders in both the government and the civil community or non-government entity, the individuals that need protection that are more likely to be targets. Do you have any consideration to assisting those individuals in their safety?
Our training is, I would say, focused on the general population. As an American, you are a target, and that is the thrust. We offer our training through a customized environment, so it would depend if it's the executives of a company that approach us, but so far our training has been not so much the executives as the workforce who needs to travel to foreign countries.
So individuals that are traveling around the world.
Because you're an American and a citizen, sometimes dependent on your job and what you do and where you do, you might be more and more at risk, but we're focused on helping Americans in general. Some of the projects that we've been working on that we have contracts for, we've been developing anti-terrorism training for first responders for the state of Idaho, and that'll be a computer-based training module that'll be released later this spring. We're developing a school intruder survival program for the schools of initially Idaho, because Idaho's paying for the research and the work, but we just submitted a grant today that will hopefully take that training throughout the nation. And that would be NIC delivering that throughout the U.S. to schools that are selected by their states and try to propagate that knowledge out there on what does that teacher or that principal do who finds themselves in a situation with an intruder and security measures have failed and now they need to minimize damage to themselves and the students and that.
So a real component here that's very, very promising, and that is your work is dealing with not only the threat we have for foreign terrorists or international terrorists, but there's been terrorism at home, and some of that is affected schools. Or here in the Northwest, at one point we had a very serious, before your existence as an institute, some domestic terrorists such as Order One and others. Mm-hmm. So it's really broad-based, isn't it, and comprehensive, what you're wanting to do for the American people.
It is. The need is broad-based, and the solution, we want to take and spread that knowledge throughout. Unforeseen audiences are appearing every day. Well, we're being approached by more and more American charity and mission organizations mm-hmm. who, because of the nature of their work as Americans, must travel to countries that are not so friendly or to countries where the threat of terrorism is higher.
We've seen a tragedy, a murder recently of religious missionaries, so they are a threat too. Right?
And we're working with New Tribes Missions, who lost Martin Burnham just this last mm-hmm. year. Has signed a contract with us to begin training this spring. So we're working with a variety of folks from a variety of walks of life, with the thing in common is that they're Americans who are trying to better prepare themselves and use some new skills to deal with this.
Some of the questions I ask now have been discussed on national media and international media, but some of them will probably, because of your expertise, this institute will be not have been discussed that much. I think we should spend some time on this program informing our viewers, which are in 7 states and in British Columbia and Alberta, Canada, about the tactics. I guess we back up and say, what are the purposes and goals of these terrorists? And then secondly, we'll talk about some of the tactics they use. But again, let's start there with, what are they trying to do?
Well, let me qualify right off by saying that I don't consider myself an expert. Knowledgeable enough to surround myself with experts.
But you're discussing with those experts daily.
Yes, hopefully some of it's rubbed off. Yeah,
I'm sure it is.
Tell me specifically, you want to start about the tactics?
Want to know, Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda, and then the other terrorists are not the only terrorists in the world. Just discuss what are they trying to do? Obviously, it starts with an obvious one that they are enemies of the United States and would like to destroy this democratic process. But talk about what are they after?
Well, I often equate, at least in my mind, a terrorist is just a schoolyard bully that got bigger tools. They have an agenda, whether that be political change, whether that be economic, if they're in it for the ransom. They have an agenda. It's quite often
there's terrorists doing things for different reasons.
There's terrorists doing things for different reasons.
Kidnapping and threat, wanting money and so forth.
They're trying to change a political process. They're trying to influence a government to do something it doesn't want to do, or a people to do something they don't want to do. Or they're in it for financial and criminal. More and more we see criminal/terrorist groups operating who are very hard to tell from just a group of criminals who's in it purely for the financial gain.
Let's take it one step further. Again, I'm not an expert either, just have read some in relation to this, and Robert, please feel free to come in on this too. But again, there's no better term to use than to say that Osama bin Laden's an evil man, and he uses evil tactics. So in some of these cases, when you talk about political change and all, but I've read a lot about the fact that his purpose is trying to take society back to an earlier time, to being an enemy of modern technology and modern developments, and that it's a fanatic approach to wanting to take upon himself to change and what I would consider to destroy the progress of the world. I'd like to get both of you to react to that. You want to start, Robert?
Well, let me preface by saying that as a community college, I think one of our focal points for this training may differ from what you might see in a university, which might be more of a think tank and analysis type function.
And that's what I'm doing right now.
Yes, you are. And I just wanted to say that our focus really is more on development of practical skills and knowledge to allow people to better deal and avoid situations related to terrorism and hostage taking. So that's where we're focused. So our speculation in response to your question is not based on a team of people who are think tanking this all day. But I think from what I've read, you're pretty much on target. You're seeing that concern of a civilization that has essentially failed to deliver invention and economic development and progress to their population, railing against a society or a component of the population that has developed and delivered on that. And the juxtaposition of those two and the anger that's being built up in those that have not succeeded is extreme. And attaching that to a theocracy structure that justifies all of their actions for religious reasons. So I think you've touched on it very accurately. But again, analyzing why people might do this isn't truly our focus. It's helping people deal with or be prepared for the actions of such individuals.
No matter what the purpose is for the action, how do you try to prevent it or get through it? Well, that was very, very articulate. So you shouldn't be apologetic, because I think you really articulated what I at least had heard from others. Just one more thing on that, and I won't harp on it any longer, but as you go down this road, and there are universities and think tanks that deal with this, gathering information from them of the motivation behind some of these, isn't that somewhat helpful, though, for your staff as you work toward trying to combat it? It's just another component that can be helpful to at least let people know. In other words, if particular terrorists are doing things with certain motives, doesn't that automatically target certain population more than other populations for terrorism?
Yeah, Robert's correct that we don't spend a lot of time on the philosophy. We do try to teach people to understand the motives of terrorism, because when you understand what a man or a woman is after, it's easier to predict their actions. Right. We do spend some time in that in training, and we are open to the research, and we constantly do our own element of research. And a great deal of what we've been doing over the last year is to create our own ability to do research here in a 2-year institution. And there's, for instance, this study we've done on intruders in public schools. There hasn't been a great amount of research on what happens when those people get past security measures. What happens from the time they take over a classroom full of kids or a cafeteria full of kids, and they're in control of that situation. So we're conducting research in new areas, and we're looking for folks who are doing the research. It's our goal to be a niche and not to compete against Texas A&M or Virginia Tech or any of the other schools that are going down those alleys, but to ally with them and take from them what we can glean in terms of corporate knowledge and apply that to practical training where we get down to the working men and women who need skills so they can go to the job and do what they do or go home and conduct life as a normal family.
Really very clearly stated. So that certainly will be part of what you're doing, gathering that data. It's like in the form of a partnership. You briefly mentioned, and I think we need to really get into that with some detail, that when the terrorists get involved with their actions, they are hoping that the population reacts a certain way. And that's where you can be such a great protection population, letting people know. Would you just take some time to share with us what, by either just threatening or actually carrying it out, what pleases the terrorists? That is, what causes them to think they've succeeded? The reaction they get from the victims.
That you're asking a very complex question to answer, and that's the subject of an hour course. A lot of what we've been doing since 9/11 is what terrorists would like to see us do, spending time, money, and resources focusing on them. One of their goals as a bully is to wave the biggest stick they can, and that big stick is, and a good analogy that an advisor of mine has made lately is, take the terrible tragedy of 9/11 and the 5,000 people dead in the buildings. It's really taken our country, I mean, some of those things we'll never get over, but the basics are we cleaned up the rubble and began to rebuild within a year. Consider the ramifications to our economy, to our lifestyles, to our education system, to all the side effects that will change how we did business. Those are long-lasting effects that some terrorists are going to see as victories. And some of those we can turn around and make them our own victories. But we can clean up the physical rubble in a year. It's the economic impacts. Consider the Lebanon cases when they took hostages. They tied up media, they tied up government resources in trying to locate and find and recover people from hostage situations. 7, 8 years. They forced us to expend our energies and our resources, limited resources, over a huge amount of time. That's a victory for a terrorist because now he's making you pay financially or with your other resources. And that's taking away from your ability to do other things that were on your agenda besides reacting to him. That's why I believe that an educated population, and eventually I think we'll see more of that infiltrate our entire public education system as we understand what terrorists do, what they want, and we refuse to give it to them. Just like if you understand bullies, you react differently to them and the bully goes away sooner. I think when you understand what they're after and you counter that with what they're not after, they're going to have to seek something else as a tool, that terrorism is going to be less effective. And we're not going to see those giant drops in the market and those huge emotional reactions. We begin to become more logical about it.
That's really clearly stated. Let's take this a step further. That you certainly described clearly that they can cost, and they have in this country, they can cost you economically. We've had to put so many more resources in on, and understandably so, and we've created a Homeland Security Department, so it's even our structure of our government. It's one of the more major reorganizations. We understand that. But Robert, may I come back to you because you're working closely with your staff on this. Do they also not attempt to cause for a democracy, and obviously the international terrorists such as the Al-Qaeda are certainly not, they're enemies of democracy. Are they also, even with threats of attacks, affecting or attempting to affect, because of our increased security, that it makes it more difficult for a free society to continue to be as free?
Yes. The balance of security and freedom has always been an issue in this nation and any nation that seeks to create a free society, because freedom and security are, in some cases, on different ends of the teeter-totter. And I think as we are pressed by this outside force to deal ever more with security, to balance that against maintaining the freedoms that we've enjoyed is going to truly be major public policy debate, which we see raging currently as we try and put in place laws and actions and steps to enhance our security and yet continue to enjoy the freedom of action, speech, and thought that we've had. A debate for the intelligent people to engage in along with the rest of us as we determine how to steer the future.
The heart of the program next week, and I always like to make that bridge for the viewers, is going to be talking to you about things you can say that can be not only comforting but can be very helpful to the general public or to leaders of a corporation, some tips you can give them, but we'll do that next week. But one other one I want to get David involved in, because you again briefly mentioned this. Am I not correct, and I'll have you to elaborate upon it, that one of the attempts of terrorists is to get a population to live in fear? Isn't the fear factor one of the major things that terrorists are attempting to do?
Getting back to the bully analogy, you're not a very successful terrorist if you can't inspire fear. It may be fear of physical harm, it may be fear of economic harm, the fear that they've sparked in will I be able to travel where I want to travel and do what I want to do, the fear that they're going to change my life, the fear that I'm not free to go out to the theater tonight or go to the mall, and fear can be directly countered with education. I mean, people who understand situations tend to have less fear and more freedom to choose.
Certainly we've seen that in the Middle East where the terrorists are willing to even die themselves to go in and self-bomb in a restaurant or at a shopping center and all. Are you having any information or learning from how people that face that almost daily, how to cope with that and how to try to convince people that you have to live your life without being consumed by fear?
You know, we recently put a gentleman from Europe on our staff. You know, he's from England, where they've lived with the IRA and the bombings, and his input is an interesting view in a country who's had to deal with it longer than we have, or on the home front. Right. So we're always considering those. And another important part of our training is part of our research program is to seek out and conduct interviews with victims and survivors.
On that note, to bring the program to conclusion, we just built a bridge for next week, and we'll talk some more about that. And we want to thank both of you gentlemen for being with us. It's been a most informative program. And ladies and gentlemen, if you'll be with us again next week at the same time, we will continue this very important discussion about terrorism. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station. Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
We welcome you back to our second program of our two-week series dealing with the problems of terrorists and terrorism. And last week I found the show most informative about what North Idaho College has put together even before that awful crime of September 11th, 2001. At North Idaho College we have what is called the Fort Sherman Institute for Human Protection, dealing both with governmental and private sector work to help train people to try to, one, prevent terrorism and how to deal with it if it does come, and we hope it doesn't. And to deal with that again this week, we welcome back Dr. Robert Ketchum. He is one of the assistant vice presidents for instruction at North Idaho College. He's also the executive director of the Workforce Training Center at our institution, and this particular institute to combat terrorism is under his supervision. Dr. Ketchum, welcome back. We're pleased to have you here.
Thank you, Tony. Glad to be here.
And I'm equally pleased to have back David Dose, who is the director of the Fort Sherman Institute for Human Protection. And you were very informative, as was Dr. Ketchum last week, and thank you for coming back again.
Thanks for having us.
My first question is directed at David. We spent so much time last week on the overall structure and purposes and all, and we want to try to be as helpful as we can this week with our viewers to make them as safe as possible, but at the same time, we walk that thin line of not revealing things that terrorists know that you use that might make them find another method of engaging in terrorism. So we'll walk that thin line. Let's talk, first of all, David, about travel, Americans traveling, and that we know from what's happened in very recent times that Americans are very, very much at risk in traveling to some parts of the world at this time. So what advice do you have to them? As President Bush has said, we must continue to go on with our lives and we must live a normal life. We must not allow terrorists to win by put us in such fear that we become paralyzed. With that, I understand that there are some things available to Americans to give them some tips and ideas to continue to travel, but to be astute and wise and how they do that and what they watch for.
Well, I can give you a couple of things, Tony. First, I think it's important to recognize that we as Americans, used to our freedom, many of us balk at being told either by the authorities or by common sense that we can't do something we want to do anymore. And that includes sometimes traveling places that common sense would say don't go or don't go now. One of the first things I would encourage people to do is you don't want to give up that spirit of freedom, but you don't want to let that overwhelm your sense of common sense at a time like this. People do need to think differently than they did 20 or 30 years ago about how an American is viewed in certain countries. There are resources available to Americans. If they're not arrogant about that first step, then they're willing to go to the second step and make use of every resource they can. And one is our own State Department, access to the internet, to the I can't tell you the exact site, but it's a State Department website, and if you just go to the general State Department website, it'll guide you there. But there's information on threats specific to countries. There's information that's directly rated towards terrorism, and there's information on criminal activity in those countries. And that kind of information automatically raises an American's awareness.
We're taping this program on February 13th, and we pray and hope that nothing happens before this program airs, that we are not just, because we're taping it earlier, that it would appear we didn't even know about it. And so, and we hope nothing does happen. But in relation to that, even these tips that you're talking about are helpful at all times. As we're taping the program, in the last day or two, the United States government has advised some of our non-essential personnel in some countries in the world to leave at this time, and part of that's also tied to the crisis in the Middle East. So would you also advise that travelers, if they continue to travel, they should be listening carefully to advice to stay away temporarily from certain places in the world?
I would advise that they not only listen to it, but consider yielding to that advice. We don't want people to panic and to react and say, I won't travel anymore. That's what the terrorists want. We do want common sense, and there's no sense in running right into the fire. There's a lot of good advice coming out from the U.S. government, and I would watch that advice. There are more and more available opportunities for education through FEMA and other sites on the internet and other government sources on actions that people can take to protect themselves here and abroad. Our own, at the Fort Sherman Institute, we offer an international travel security course that we offer to corporations who have workforces that need to travel as part of their job so that they can get on with their daily jobs and take reasonable steps to protect their people. I would suggest that people not see themselves as not important enough to be considered a target. Because you're an American right now, I think that puts you in a category that you should take advantage of every available asset.
And Israel's in the same position, and Israelis or Jewish people, as they travel, they too have the same kind of target. So there's some populations as they travel at this point are more at risk. Robert, may I come back to you, because you can rely upon some of your experience. You do extensive traveling in your work, particularly to Asia. And so would you join with David in talking about, I guess the term I'll use, do not stand out and be obvious. So would you share some of the experiences that you try to use and the tips that we can do so that you're not got like a neon sign as you're traveling that I'm an American?
Well, I have an advantage. I took David's course.
Okay.
And that was very helpful. And I understand because of that, David's reticence to go into too much specificity, because you don't want to tell, quote unquote, the bad guys what you're doing to try and avoid and prepare for possible hazards. But I think the key is learning and awareness, as David's explained, because learning and awareness tends to remove the fear. We've known as educators that building knowledge in people helps remove them from the darkness and pull them into an era of knowledge and awareness, and that is a key element in what is being emphasized in this whole thing. But odd little tidbits come up. I just recently became aware of something that's sort of an anti-crime tip that I read, and as a working professional, I think many working professionals put in those autoresponder messages when you prepare to go on a vacation or be out of the office for work-related travel, and typically used to, well, I'm out of town between this date and this date, and put that in, and everybody in the office gets that. Well, actually, there are spammers now that are sending out bulk emails specifically looking for those replies, which provides specific information of probably a well-paid professional who's out of their home, likely between certain dates. And so there's
inviting
actually
a break-in.
So actually now there's a recommendation coming because of that you may not want to do those autoresponder emails anymore, that you're going to be out of the office between certain dates. So that's something I've started to do just from having picked up that, and that's simply the awareness that's grown in me as a result of what I've learned through this program and being involved with this for these many months.
This is so obvious that we're not giving anything away we shouldn't. When people travel, how they dress and all is important. You know, I would say that I certainly could say that you wouldn't want to wear caps or T-shirts and all announcing that you're a graduate of some university or some particular thing that identifies you so much as an American. I mean, I think giving that kind of information is just helpful. And so would you like to elaborate upon that?
Well, I think that's very valid. I know in my own life, I had occasion to be in Iran in 1980, just sort of at the leading edge of the revolution, and I was with a group of Americans. And as I look back on it, I think many of the things we were doing were very wrong. We traveled in groups. We were pretty well highlighted as Americans. It was my first experience with an automatic weapon in my face. I had, along with a subgroup I was part of, had our passports seized by authorities at one point, which threatened our ability to move or even leave the country. And the thing we were most doing wrong in that was being highly visible as a group of Americans. And based on what I know now, being older and wiser and having experienced this training, I wouldn't do it the same way. Because I think we put ourselves at much greater risk by being very highly visible as a large group of Americans all together in a situation where that made us rather much a target.
Dave, would you like to add to this issue of advice and not standing out while traveling?
I would take it at a practical level. We're encouraging people, as I would have encouraged them before, not to be an ugly American, not to be, I'm never ashamed of being an American, but I have enough common sense not to advertise that when I don't know who's in the crowd, because I'd like to come home and continue to be an American. And so the way you dress is important, but the way you act, the ability to communicate, if you can't speak the language, at least to carry a phrase book, or the ability to communicate. Do you go traveling to a foreign place and know what assets are available to you there? We all know 911 here. I've run into Americans who are surprised it doesn't work in every other country. Do you know how to reach an American embassy? Do you have backups of your passport and copies and things in case things are stolen or lost, or you get into a situation? Do you carry spare passport photos and all those things that would help you out if you ran into trouble with terrorism or crime or became the victim of anything because of your Americanness? And so there are a lot of things you can do that help you blend in and appear sensitive to the culture you're into and not as a standout or as a dare.
Between the two of you, that is really intelligent advice. And even if there weren't terrorists, there was some of those things like having a copy of passport in case you lost it. All those just make very much sense. I want to talk a little bit for a moment about the awful weapon that the terrorists used when they took over airplanes and flew them into the buildings and died themselves. It's obvious when they take over a plane and they're willing to die that that's become a weapon. And the people in that plane are not going to survive once they take control. And then those great heroes in the flight in Pennsylvania, that the Americans that brought the plane down, otherwise it would have gone to some building, it appears in Washington, D.C., and added to the magnitude of the tragedy. I just want to get your reaction to the fact that if a group of Americans are on a domestic flight, and there is the beginning of an attempt to take over that airline by a group that you know is going to bring it into a building and die, is your advice to the people like it was in Pennsylvania that they must not let that happen? They must, as a group and unite, they must, as those heroes do, they just must stop it.
If you're asking if I agree with this idea of picking up anything you have and throwing it at them, I would exercise, again, education and caution. We have to consider how many hundreds of skyjackings we've had of American or other aircraft over the last 30 years, mm-hmm. and out of that, how many were truly suicide missions.
So that's the first problem, the distinction.
That's the first problem. That has to be done first. The automatic response of fighting back is probably a good way to get, somebody's going to get hurt. If indeed you've determined, after consideration, that you're a part of what's going to become a weapon or a suicide flight, that does limit your options, and you have to admire the folks who had the courage to act on that in the past. But I would exercise that first step, that you need to determine that first, because of the hundreds of hijackings, relatively small, 2-3%, maybe even less, I haven't done the math, were in fact those suicide, where the others were negotiated out or there was some other means of ending that.
The heroes on that flight, among other things, technology helped in this case. It's my understanding that the cellular phone, that they were able to find out that the other planes were being used as weapons, and so that gave them the kind of information they needed, did it not? So that's another thing, even though I know there's some restrictions on using certain electronics on flights, because of interfering with the communication system of the plane, but having that kind of knowledge and all could also, in the future, also help to be preventive.
I think technology is one of the many tools that we will use to minimize this situation.
Let's talk about people at home, domestically. And we have really tightened security at airports, and we understand the need for that. And I've been doing quite a bit of traveling. I've been speaking around the United States, dealing with human rights issues, and I've been very aware of the tightened security. And I felt better about flying, knowing that there was a decreased chance that a weapon would be brought into a plane. But with that in mind, let's just talk about at home, visiting certain places in particular, like shopping centers or going into high-rise buildings and so forth. Can you, within the restrictions you have, can you also make some suggestions, and this is to both of you, some suggestions to the American people about, use common sense and not live a life of fear, but how can we become more aware of things around us that could possibly help in calling the right law enforcement and all that might prevent something happening by watching around you?
I think a good comparison is somebody who lives in a big city where there are certain parts of town that are rough and you're going to probably lose your wallet or something like that. You become culturally aware. That's a part of your cultural education. If you live in that environment, you get used to what to look for, what time of the day not to be in certain places, or how to purport yourself in those areas. I think as we spread our education and training and discuss this issue in America, that same sort of awareness builds in you, not towards the criminal side now, but towards the terrorist who's not after the wallet, but needs a large place where he can do mass damage. And so that starts to guide where you go and when you go. And just like knowing that certain places there's a higher chance of being mugged or something like that, I work my life around that, and I still make my life work. I accept that as a fact, and I deal with it. I don't let it keep me from ever leaving my home. I think that's where we have to head with the whole thing in terrorism. The trick is getting people educated on what that is. That's going to take some time and some experience, but it is a parallel to the criminal things. There are certain patterns, you know.
Robert, I ask you to elaborate upon that, and that is that David certainly has brought a point to my mind is as we live our daily lives, in particular people who are very much mobile in our country, that there are moments of some days or some weeks that you're more at risk depending on the very location. If you're in a rural area and you're visiting a relative, it's not the same as if you're in a very populous area where there's a lot of activity going on.
I think that's true. The challenge is we're in a instantaneous communication society where we're inundated with all this information, and all of us are constantly bombarded by things that could potentially be a threat to us. We hear about the latest microbe. We hear about the latest concern about food not being pure. We hear about every little thing that might happen, a meteorite that might be coming our way. And all of that tends to increase the level of stress and concern in people. And you add to that a whole new layer of potential external threat, and it just increases that entire buzz that's going on in the nervous system for everyone. Knowledge is really one of our key pieces to counter that, and gaining a piece of information such as, that risk might be more increased in a place where there's a large volume of people as opposed to, being in a more remote location because the terrorist wants to have the impact on large numbers, will increase your ability to be alert and be able to make wise decisions as to where to put yourself. So I think, again, it's exercising knowledge and information to react in a proper manner.
I'd like to follow up on that. I think it's important that if your viewers understand a phenomenon I've noticed lately, not to take your anti-terrorism training from the media. The media is a tool to make you aware of a problem. There are lots of extremely good pieces of information coming through there, but there's a lot of filtering that needs to be done. And a lot of that is resulting in people who everything they know about the problem came from that 30-minute newscast they just watched, CNN's latest or something, and from there they're reacting and talking to the neighbors. Take that motivation, go to the Department of State on the internet, go to FEMA, go to some of those government sources out there that have really good advice. Before you take that news anchor's advice to go buy plastic sheeting and duct tape, stop and figure out what that's going to do for me, and use those government sources that are out there, or those educational sources, to determine the best course of action. When GM sends me a warning that my model of truck blows up now and then, before I panic and get rid of that truck, I'm going to do a little research. I would say people should exercise the same thing with the whole terrorism environment.
It's good to be alert to statistics. As we know, the lottery is successful because it's a tax on the statistically challenged who don't understand really that the odds are such that it's such an unlikely event that they'll ever win that they're really just throwing their money after a dream. That's it's also the case that there are meteorites that strike homes, that there are plane crashes, but if you look at and understand how unlikely some of these events are, and you realize that as an individual, the likelihood of you being the target of a terrorist attack on a statistical basis is not yet very significant. The odds of being struck by lightning. I think getting information and understanding and taking simple steps to be able to reduce your chances of becoming that unlikely event, that's important, and that's the key in this thing, is to get information and know how, with simple actions, you can greatly improve your odds of not being in that statistic.
That's such a good example, and it makes me think of an analogy. It's just like when you're driving on certain roads. When you get on certain roads, you're more at risk, and some roads are better than others, and so forth. And so when you're on a road where there's been a lot of danger and accidents, you just become much more cautious and aware and careful when you're driving. Although you should be, obviously sensitive at all times about how you drive, but your just level of awareness needs to rise because you're in greater danger.
True.
I want, Robert, you take a few minutes to talk to the people who are out there that belong to different, are good viewers, but also they may be corporate leaders who are traveling and all. Those who have not had any training yet or having information, can you share with them about your institute, how you could be helpful to them? I know you have these classes and they can come and take them, but this is a wonderful opportunity for you to tell them about your service in a little more specific way, and then I'll ask David too, and then also how to get in touch with you.
Well, I appreciate that opportunity, Tony. As a community college, community colleges often do work on contract for various entities, and we do as a community college. We contract with companies in the region, the nation, and even overseas for a variety of training services. We can deliver at anyone's location at their convenience.
So you can go there, they don't have to come here.
Absolutely. They can contact North Idaho College, Fort Sherman Institute, directly and engage in a process of discussion that can lead to a contract proposal for training at the time and location and convenience to meet their needs, and actually to include those training components that best meet their needs. So we do this on a very
components for different needs.
Yes, it can be done on a very customized basis, and that's really the expertise of Fort Sherman Institute, both training on site as well as training here and meeting the customer's needs.
David, I want you to elaborate, and also we should give them a phone number or a website, whatever information that you'd like to
Probably
give.
the easiest thing would be the website, because you can find all the contact information there. It's www.fortshermaninstitute.org, and that'll give you the information you need to get hold of us if you need to further discuss training. Robert's right in that we're prepared to train at our own facilities in the Post Falls, Coeur d'Alene area, as well as to deliver training. It's important to emphasize that we are trying to meet a variety of Americans' needs, from first responders to business travelers to school teachers to the National Guard, and lately again the missionaries and the charity groups that are moving around overseas. We can do more than just training. We've been helping some companies and organizations with policy. How do you as a company address these issues for your employees? How do you help your people protect themselves through some guidance from the company, just like we have policies in place to protect people in the workplace all the time? How do you modify your existing policy to cover some of these new areas? Those are things that we try to assist with and then train people to.
I just really try to serve my viewers. I'm very, very grateful to them, and that's why we're still in the air for 31 years. I have a feeling that some of my friends out there have gone to get a pencil and a piece of paper and write down the website. So I'm going to take this opportunity to have you to slowly give them the website again so they can be in touch if they need to.
Okay, that website is www.fortshermaninstitute.org.
Okay, that's easy to remember. Now then, I have a question for that came to mind during that process. These good people that are coming to you for knowledge, and as Robert has said, that the more knowledge you have, I'll use the word empowering you to be safer and more use of common sense in the process. But we hope this never happens. But if someone was to hear about your institute and they have bad motives, they want to learn these techniques, and maybe they're going to engage in something terrible like kidnapping or whatever, how do you screen your people that you're going to give the class to so that you don't ever train any terrorists?
Well, I guess that's always something that we have to be cognizant of. We do not offer public classes other than through Productivity Point International in Spokane. We offer a basic travel class. But these advanced classes and courses that could create some damage are offered in a customized environment to a company who knows who its employees are, or to a government agency that we can verify who's taken the training.
You know, that's what I want to hear you say, because you know the company or you know the government, and those are the key classes that deal with giving very valuable information that terrorists should not have.
Can I make
sure,
a comment about it?
Sure.
You know, one of my only criticisms of what's happening in our country today is that we are undoing half of what we're doing by sharing just a little bit too much. And I understand the debate between freedom of information and that. but common sense says you don't tell all the burglars the code to your alarm. And sometimes, and so anything we've done today, we're not trying to appear cryptic. We're just trying not to render neutral everything we're doing for these people that we're trying to train.
That's a really important point, and we've tried to be sensitive about that on the show today, and I think we've
done a great job.
Walked that line very carefully, but still at the same time gave some valuable information to the public without giving away your, like you're saying, the code to your signals of what might happen. We're just about out of time, and Robert, we would just close with you by saying, in very, very few moments, how optimistic are you about the Institute in the future?
We are extremely optimistic with the customers that are now contacting us. Our business plan is well on track, and we do expect NIC to be well known very quickly.
And I think you're maybe even ahead of what you anticipated when you first opened up.
Well, I think this is well in line with David's dream for achievement based on his experience. But I think all of us at the college that are involved are just thrilled and glad that David's dream is being fulfilled very quickly.
Dr. Robert Ketchum and David Dose, thank you so much for being with us these 2 weeks. You're busy people. You're going to be traveling a lot. We did this taping on February 13th before you start some more extensive travel, and we really are grateful in this program that you came here, and I know you've helped our viewers. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings to conclusion our 2-week series on terrorism, and next week we'll move to another subject. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.